Hi, everyone. Welcome to Dragonboat's CPO series webinar. Thank you for joining us. My name is Josh Berman. I'm head of product marketing at Dragonboat, and I'll be your MC for today's session. If this is your first time attending one of Dragonboat's CPO series events, I'd like to share a special welcome. For context setting, the CPO series is a platform where world-class chief product officers share their firsthand experiences in building products, leading companies, and perfecting their craft. Whether you're a CPO in an adjacent role or you're aspiring to be a CPO someday, our CPO community has something for you. Check it out on our website to access past recordings, helpful information, and apply to speak at one of our future events if you're so inclined. Before we start, I'll go over a few housekeeping items. Today's session is about a half an hour with a Q&A at the end. It's live, it will be recorded, and it will be available for on-demand viewing after the event. If you have any questions throughout the session, feel free to drop them in chat, and we'll be sure to address them during the Q&A portion of the presentation. Sorry about that, I got a little ahead of myself there. So before we dive into our amazing topic for today, I'd like to acknowledge that it would not be possible without Dragonboat. Dragonboat is the #1 product operations platform that enables product leaders to maximize business impact through effective product and portfolio management. It provides a single platform to manage your entire product operating model. Now let's unpack that a little bit further. A product operating model reflects how a product organization operates to deliver customer and business outcomes via its product investments. Now, I share this as background for the session, but in review of the key elements in a typical product operating model that you see here on the screen, I'd like to note that in today's session, we'll cover the strategies and outcomes piece, branching into the opportunities and insights. We'll share a link where you can learn more about these topics in chat. Now, okay, on to our main event. It is my pleasure to welcome today's guest speaker, Vanessa Garber. Vanessa is the CPO of Global Mobile Apps at Toyota North America and board president of the nonprofit Leading Women in Technology. With nearly 15 years of product leadership in startups and Fortune 100 companies, she is known for innovation, strategic vision, and creating 0 to 1 products. Vanessa is passionate about empowering teams to achieve impactful outcomes by putting people first. And that brings us to today's topic, balancing act, going beyond near-term revenue for real impact. Now, Vanessa, without further ado, I want to hand it over to you, and you can take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Josh. I appreciate the intro. And hey, everybody. Good morning. I think before we get into the main topic, I do want to just give a nod to, Toyota in terms of talking about going beyond what's immediately in front of you to think about that impact of the future. I'm not sure if you're all aware, but Toyota is an 87-year-old company and is constantly going through transformations. If you think back to early days, the founder Toyota actually started by creating looms. He was trying to improve the life for his mother and for women in his community, and grew that from a better loom at home to manufacturing superpower, and took that knowledge and expertise and passion and moved into automotive. And to do those kind of transformations on an ongoing basis, it really takes this idea of thinking for the future, thinking about society and the impact that we can have. Right now, that future is really in this idea of the software-defined vehicles. It's really about how are we doing software transformations in this future. And as one of the largest manufacturer of physical goods on the planet, those transformations take time. It's unrealistic to think that it's going to happen overnight. But transformation drivers are not only grounded in revenue, right? There are some gotchas when you think about focusing solely on that near-term impact. If you're trying to go beyond for like what Toyota's doing for the future of mobility and a real positive impact on society. And so I want to take that as an example to think about, ground us in the topic of what we're going to be discussing today. Next slide, please. So what does it take to go beyond this focus on near-term revenue? Well, I really think that looks at a balanced strategy. I think the term strategy gets tossed around a lot. We use it to mean a bunch of different things, but at the basic definitional level, a strategy is a plan or policy designed to achieve an aim, to achieve a goal. And I think what's really important to note in that is the goal is at the end, but it's the how. It's that middle piece of that action that I think sometimes gets missed if we're just thinking about where we're trying to end up. If you're not familiar with the book Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rummelt, I think he's got a really crisp definition of how we can think about this holistically. I'm just going to read this aloud. Unlike a standalone decision or goal, a strategy is a coherent set of analyses, concepts, policies, arguments, and actions that respond to a high-stakes challenge. And I think that high-stakes challenge is something as product leaders we're super familiar with, right? We look at our market, we understand the needs of our customer, we're trying to align those business goals. But as we look at revenue, if we're just looking at that as the target, we're not really here to solve a problem. And so I think a balanced strategy should consider an equitable exchange in value between the business and the customer. It's that broader landscape. And the role that data plays is, and this shouldn't be new to any of us, but maybe it's good to get back to basics, is data is the view, that insight and information needed in order to make an informed decision, but that decision should lead to action. And I think that's something that sometimes we miss when we think about strategy. Next slide, please. And so we end up with this narrow focus. We can end up looking really closely at something very specific and miss the broader picture. I was reminded of Goodhart's law, which is when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure, right? We can lose ourselves. It's suddenly just that one thing. So if you're just looking for revenue or just looking to, improve growth or optimize one particular thing, you miss the broader landscape. And I think there's two categories of mistake when you have this narrow focus. I kind of put these into these two buckets. One is blinders on, and the other is looking good. When you've got your blinders on, you've got this myopically narrow focus, potentially on the metrics and measures, and you lose sight of the problem you're trying to solve. There's a failure to account for context. Certainly the customer gets lost along the way, and you're just turning the crank to try and optimize for maybe that near-term focus, for maybe that one metric you need to achieve for your goals this quarter or this year. Another part of the blinders on is analysis paralysis. You can get stuck just looking at the metrics. You can just get stuck looking at the data and discussing it. But if it doesn't lead to action, really, is that data or is that analysis serving its purpose? I think that can be a struggle for some folks. And the last area I'll say in this is, if you're just looking at the data, we might be ignoring our intuition. We might lose sight of creativity. I'm not saying this always happens, but certainly if all you're looking at day in, day out is revenue, or the red and green lights of the Christmas tree of your data dashboards, is there really space to be creative or to do gut checks? I know product has evolved beyond the basic gut check, but intuition and insights and aha moments happen beyond the narrow focus. The other one I'll just touch on briefly is looking good. We might end up collecting data and organizing it in such a way where we're cherry picking metrics and having a very selective use of data with the intention of confirming our bias or confirming that test that we're trying to, or we're asking our teams to try and solve for. So I think data misinterpretation and incomplete data sets, when we've got that narrow focus, can result in us saying, hey, everything's great. And I know I've certainly been at startups and I've seen other organizations where everything is up and to the right and everything is green. And then one day you run out of money or you're in dire straits. You're like, wait a minute, what we were looking at this whole time showed that things were up and to the right. What happened? And so I think some of that can happen when you are busy trying to look good. And so it's really important for us to think about having balanced metrics, finding that middle ground and reviewing data in light of the company mission, that balanced strategy or your objectives. It's got to play into that bigger picture. Next slide, please. So I think before I get into kind of these kind of practical, tactical tips for driving real impact and how can we combat this narrow focus, I want to just quickly touch on going too broad. Once upon a time, I worked for a company where I was doing kind of product innovation consulting and was working with a company trying to add an Android app into their lineup. They had an iOS app and now they wanted to add Android. And I was visiting them and their executive team frequently to discuss kind of where the project was going and the direction they wanted things to take. And every time I showed up, they had 5 most important things. They're like, these are our 5 priorities. And I said, great, you've kind of got this really clear view. You've got these 5 items. Well, which is the most important one? And they say, no, 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 all of them are important. And even though I worked with them for years, I never got away from this kind of scattershot approach of always having 5. And in so doing, their strategy was so broad, the actions that they ended up taking were more like whack-a-mole, and they never really got something to done. They never really achieved one of those major milestones. And so I think that's a trap as well, is going too broad, and I think just worthy of a quick mention. So how do we balance priorities and investments? Thinking about short and long-term sets of work. I like to imagine, just go on this little journey with me, where we're in a hotel, we both have heavy suitcases. It's the 1990s, so there's no wheels. There's no, it's high friction. Got to carry the thing. And at the end of the hall, the elevator is opening. I drop the heavy bag. I say, you get this. And I run to the end of the hall. I sprint and I hold the door while you're stuck lugging both bags to meet me. This is the idea of sprinting. We do this all the time. We think, hey, we'll have somebody carry the bags. We'll have somebody or some number of teams working on these longer term investments, and we'll have folks sprint. But the risk is, especially when we're thinking about revenue, oh, well, I'm just going to do this quick sprint. I'm just going to leave the bags there for a little bit longer. No one has to pick them up just yet. And that means you're only doing things that are maybe 6 to 8 weeks long, but everybody knows, even in the smallest startup, not everything can get done in 2 months. So as part of that strategy, you really need to think about a broader portfolio. So eventually those bags don't pile up and they're too heavy to carry and you get stuck. It can happen to the biggest and the smallest companies. So that ability to shape and drive your impact and influence revenue over time, I think is a really important piece to think about. Another part of investing is innovation. I don't know how many of you have worked at an innovation organization or maybe had the opportunity to, run an innovation team or group, but it's very exciting. You get some money, you have time, you're going to go and, try and solve some major problems, and you don't know if it's going to pan out. You're not sure if that will ever make it to production. But after a year or two, and I think we're seeing this in today's economic climate in particular, someone comes up and goes, we are spending quite a lot of money on this innovation area. Well, why? What are they doing? And so in an age where money is more expensive, where companies are tightening their belts, we've seen layoffs, right? That's continued to be a trickle. You really have to have a great case for these investments to make sense over time. You also need to be able to make a case for, hey, if we don't innovate, we might be stuck. We might not be able to make progress in the future. And so you've just got to make sure you've got that really tightly tied back to your holistic strategy. I want to pivot to this thing in the middle, establish do no harm metrics. I think some other folks think about these as guardrail metrics. Say that 10 times fast. But these are critical business indicators designed to catch potential negative side effects when you're launching a new product or adding a new feature, or you've got teams doing something new with an A/B test. This is where I've got an example. From a couple years back, I went to a conference and some members of the Google Maps team were present. And they were talking about some initiatives where their North Star goal was to reduce commute time, which I am a big fan of. I would love to spend less time in my car commuting. But they ended up clogging, and I think you may have seen this, little neighborhoods, quiet, sleepy streets that used to have kids playing on them that now are essentially major inner roads for traffic jams. And at the time, that team showed remorse. They said, hey, I wish we'd been thinking about or had some guardrails in place to say we want to reduce commute time, but not at the cost of these neighborhoods. And it's certainly something they were working to resolve. But having that upfront, having that broader view upfront and context would have been really helpful. I think maybe an example that will resonate or be clear to more of us today is growth versus retention. I'll kind of think of the e-commerce example, but if you've got teams that are focused on basket size or total revenue brought in, how often do we see that maybe they're not looking at refunds? Maybe they're not looking at contacts to call centers and the impact that they're having there. So having some guardrails or some more balanced view for their OKRs or objectives can really combat this tendency to put those blinders on and end up in kind of a hole. So you define that range of acceptable behavior in both performance and business metrics that end up defining the space in which the team or the organization can successfully play. And I think this ties back to balanced incentives, right? I truly believe that individuals and teams behave in ways in which they are incentivized. So if you're told, hey, you're going to get that promotion, you're going to get that raise, you're going to be less likely to be laid off in the current in the company interest if you move this number from here to here. And so when you create your OKRs and goals, if you don't have that mix of near and long-term measures, you can lose sight, your teams can lose sight of fitting into that broader strategy and vision. I think another way that we might combat this is having shared goals across cross-functional team members. If you set up, I can't tell you how many times this has happened to me, the product organization has set its OKRs and goals. Maybe they've had some initial conversations with engineering, but you show up and engineering goes, gosh, we have some different objectives this quarter. It's going to be really hard for us to work on this strategy together or achieve the full potential of this. So having those conversations as a leadership organization upfront to really go across design and engineering and analytics or whomever are your counterparts to make sure that if they're not the same, there's some continuity, there's some thread where people are incentivized together to work towards that plan of action, that balanced strategy, I think is really critical. Something else that I've seen in terms of communication is you spent all this time coming up with a strategy, you put together maybe a 2-page or 3-pager, you send it out to your team, and someone comes back later and it's like, well, I shared it once, or I share it quarterly, or I sent it in an email. And that level of communication, oh, I sent it once, I wouldn't assume your team or the organization is really grounded in the strategy if you're not saying it early and often. There was a tactic I started using when I was consulting and have continued forward into my teams today, where I did this exercise, this most important thing workshop, and we'd have a single slide. There'd be some kind of framing sentence structure around what we were trying to achieve. And when I would meet with some of the clients twice, sometimes 3 times a week, every meeting I would have that slide up as the first opener and say, hey, everybody, is this still the same? And they go, yeah, Vanessa, we've seen this. We know this is the strategy. We know this is where we're aiming. You don't need to say it again. But let me tell you, the day where someone comes in and goes, I think something's changed, it's really helpful to have that reference point and that be the moment where you can pull on the brakes and say, hey, we got to discuss this because the whole organization is moving in this direction. If we need to make a change, it has a huge ripple impact. So I encourage you to bring it up often, to have some visual that you can reference back to, and it's got to happen on a regular cadence, if not weekly, frequently. And on the counterpoint of that, people will remember what you ask them about most. So if you're sending text messages or Slack messages or team messages and you say, hey, what's going on with the schedule? Hey, what's going on with revenue? Hey, I saw the dashboard. This metric is down. You basically, this habituation of your team members, of your leadership team, you can teach them that actually the most important thing is this other item. So you've got to remember that what you're discussing with your people is what they're going to remember. And so from the most senior person on your team to maybe the most junior, you can take these opportunities where maybe they're pitching an idea for a product. Maybe they're talking about their OKRs. There's an A/B test they want to run. You can say, hey, that's a cool concept. Can you help me understand how that matches and aligns with this broader strategic vision that we have right now? And you will get people in the habit of talking about what's the most important thing, where are we aiming as a team? And it's really the responsibility of leadership to ground folks and really create that gravity well that pulls people towards the strategy. And you don't want to encourage people to deviate from that. Next slide, please. So I know I've been talking at you for a minute, but all of this is to say really that to go beyond revenue for real impact, a balanced strategy includes how you will achieve a goal, right? How you will get there, that plan of action. Set clear guardrails, have some boundaries, throw some elbows, so that you can say, hey team, we've got this broader concept, this vision, and we're gonna apply that through some near and long-term investments and have that be a really good balance. And communicate frequently. Keep that line of sight on your strategy. Make sure that's the drumbeat of your communication, because I think this will really ground people in not putting those blinders on and having that broader context. So thank you so much. I think we've still got some time left for Q&A. Wanted to make sure I left some room, but thank you so much. I really appreciate the time.
Yeah, awesome. Vanessa, thanks so much for, bringing to light all these helpful tips to create this balanced strategy that everyone's hoping to, drive in their businesses, whether they're a CPO or, any adjacent role.
That's right.
They all have a part in that process. So I appreciate you sharing these tips and also just bringing more color around this topic. Yeah, with that, let's go ahead and move things into the Q&A portion of today's session. So if you do have any questions, I encourage you to submit them over chat. And while we're waiting for some of those to come in, I thought it'd be helpful to share some resources with you. So if you'd like to get in touch with Vanessa and maybe learn about the organization that she works with, Leading Women in Technology, here is access to her LinkedIn profile where you can hit her up. And if you're looking to operationalize your product operating model, potentially apply some of what you've learned in today's session, I encourage you to book a demo with Dragon Boat and see it in action. So while we have those on the screen there, let me just check the chat really quick to see if anything's come up. But
I don't see any question yet, Josh, but I think I want to mention that, with Dragon Boat, which is something that we're using at Toyota today, keeping that line of sight on your broader strategy and communicating that out so you're not stuck saying, oh, always show the schedule, always show, the revenue numbers. I think there's some views and some ways to leverage Dragon Boat to show that bigger picture. I know that's certainly helped because everyone's got different questions, right? The CFO's got different questions, the CEO's got some other views, but you can actually, instead of just answering the one question they asked, you can, if you've got all of your information organized well, there's this real opportunity to, rather than spending 40% of your team's time pulling together reports, there's an opportunity to leverage Dragon Boat to solve some of these things. So I think it's certainly worth checking out.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment there, and adding that into the conversation. I think it goes to it probably um, shortcuts to the answer of a question that I had for you as I was listening to your conversation here. But I was curious about what are those biggest blockers and trying to apply some of these tips that you provide. I imagine applying a tool in some context can help in that regard, but is there anything else that you know from your experience or you see from others that you talk to that is just like preventing them from applying some of these, what I would view as fundamental things for driving, your strategy?
I think it's a good way of thinking about like what are our blockers? um, sometimes we try to get too fancy.
Yeah.
Sometimes we try to get too clever. Um, Sometimes we're trying to, use a technology instead of solve a problem. There's a fabulous woman, Julie Zhu, who has a three-step set of questions. But the first one, she was a executive at Facebook. She did a lot of product design. She started always by saying, what is the real human problem we are trying to solve? Right? As we have to solve a problem for real customers. Sometimes we invent problems. Sometimes we find data that confirms a problem exists, which maybe isn't quite so high stakes, that isn't worth quite as much money as we anticipate. And I think really grounding yourself in those real high stakes challenges and being determined to come up with a plan of action and not just a set of measures is something that I've seen a lot, especially in OKR development or maybe some organizations who don't have as much muscle in building out that upfront plan. They're like, we're going to hit this target. And you're like, well, why? Everyone wants to make money. Otherwise we wouldn't probably be doing this. Maybe you'd be volunteering, maybe you'd be on a beach. But I think we can get in our own way when we try to be clever and we don't ground ourselves in, I think I said this earlier, that balance between value for the customer and the business. It's finding that sweet spot to maintain product market fit and keep those dollars rolling in because people will pay and I think they think has value and not just value for free. I think we've seen this in the fleeing from the freemium model, right? It used to be everything was freemium. Oh, we'll just get them in the door and then it will be fine. We're like, oh, maybe that doesn't work. Now we've set that expectation that thing should be free. So I think I've wandered a bit off the original question, but
No,
that's
no,
kind
that's
of how I think about it.
yeah, no, no. I think that's great. I guess another kind of question that's in the same vein is just like, how do companies deal with this challenge? Like data is everywhere, and I know that you're advocating for like not, focusing on things too specifically. You got to create that balance, and you got to establish those guardrails and everything like that. But with data just kind of popping up everywhere, like how do they reconcile?
I Yeah, I think one of the big things is remembering the questions you're trying to answer. The data is to support addressing a hypothesis or an inquiry or a supposition. And so you might be collecting too much data. Maybe you're collecting the wrong data. Um, Maybe it's not enough. And I think, a lot of companies are talking about being data driven, and that's very much in the parlance, but not everybody has the same set of kind of expert practitioners to help you make sure you are collecting the right things. And I think knowing what you're collecting and then knowing how to read it in a broader context, that's really critical. So starting with the basics and the fundamentals of what are we collecting and why, and what are the core questions we're trying to answer. I think is that grounding point that might sound silly, it might sound simple, but I think helps us not get out over our skis.
Yeah, that's really great. I think that we're probably at the allotted time for today's session. Any other parting thoughts or anything else that you wanted to share, Vanessa?
Yeah, I think it's just doubling down on action, right? We are here to make things that people love to use and want to pay for. And so I would really encourage you all, if you haven't read Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, that might be a good place to start. But just remember when someone comes and says, oh, we're gonna, our strategy for the quarter is hit this number. You're like, ah, Vanessa said, not enough, not enough. So if you remember nothing else, I would say, start with action.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to host this event with us and share all the wonderful wisdom that you've gathered in your time. Um, Thanks so much again, Vanessa. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure. It was a total pleasure. Thanks, everybody.